Welcome to the Profitable NDIS Provider Podcast, where we're joined by your hosts, Tanya Gomez and Paul Bryan. In each episode, we'll be sharing valuable insights and tips to help you turn your NDIS business into a profitable venture. So whether you're just starting out or looking to take your business to the next level, you've come to the right place. Let's stop surviving and start thriving.
G'day and welcome to a special episode of the Profitable NDIS Provider Podcast. My name is Paul and I'm here today with my awesome co-host Tanya. And today we are chatting with Debbie Kindness from NDIS Property Australia about all this cool stuff in the new NDIS review. So we're going to have a deep dive into this. Guys, welcome. How you going? Hi, Tanya.
Thanks, Paul. And yes, thanks, Debbie, for joining us. Really, we wanted to just jump in here really quickly to talk about this review. We know it's a hot topic. It's all over socials. It's all over the news. And we wanted to really today focus around the living and accommodation side of things. And we're going to do a few episodes around it with a few different experts. So today we've got the wonderful Debbie Kindness talking to us about housing and living recommendations specifically, which is recommendations 8 and 9 in the report. A quick debrief for anyone who hasn't been watching the space. There's been an NDIS review come out. They've made 26 recommendations, 139 actions, and they've really broken those into four sections, being a unified system of support, market supports for systems that empower people with disability, stewardship of the system, and a 5-year transition. So I think we might first go to you, Debbie, and obviously welcome you, but also get your interpretation of what this means.
Hello, thank you so much for having me on again. It's great to be here. And really interested to do a little bit of unpacking of what came out in this report, which was, look, on first glance, in general, quite good. I think the recommendations, a lot of it's really welcomed, but there was a little bit of a surprise in there. Just very briefly, that is that they are talking about SDA being removed from the SDA design guidelines and basically replaced with a lower level of SDA housing that is only going to be funded for the support. So kind of not really a replacement at all. I guess it's going to be a bit of a shake-up of the SIL housing more than anything. So that's the main thing that we got out of it. Also, a mention that the average shared support ratio should be not fixed, but should be based on the 1-3, when we thought that the 1-2 was becoming more of a common desired living ratio and support ratio. And the other major thing really that came out of this was the mandated separation of SIL and SDA supports.
Yeah, yeah. And we all saw that.
So, as you know, we have been talking about that for so long. Yeah. So, that's sort of the main things from the home and living side of it, especially the SDA side of it, that we've really been, so very shocked at, certainly the IL.
Yeah. And Paul, what was your initial?
Oh, look, I'm still sifting through it. I think for the third time now, taking my own hot takes on everything there. But you know, a couple of those things that Debbie brought up, particularly that separation between SIL and SDA, it's going to be more of a very cold cut line, which I think is going to be really good for a lot of the people in the space here. But as Deb said, it was one of those things we sort of saw coming. But the amount of providers I talked to who still don't quite understand SDA, I think this will be a really good just separation for them. But I am really interested to see how they're going to handle that IL being removed out of it, because how many homes are currently in Interblock at the moment? So it'll be interesting.
Well, from what I understand about the current stock and current funding for participants, that's going to remain as is, I believe. It's just there won't be people being funded for IL in the future, and IL stock will stop getting certification. The big question around that is, when is that going to happen? What kind of a timeline? Obviously, there's a 5-year timeline being requested to roll out all of these recommendations in this report. But for something like this, we have a number of buyers who have currently got contracts underway to build an IL property. Do they pull it? Do they upgrade their plans? Is it possible to do that even? When do we say, okay, now we stop doing IL? Do we do it now, or is this going to be something that's going to maybe gradually happen over the next 1, 2, 3 years?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Tanya, what are your initial reactions here? I'd love to find out.
Yeah, so the first thing for me, I know we're not talking about this today, but the most interesting thing for me as an Ndis auditor and someone that's registered 53% of the market is this whole idea of having to be a registered provider. I think we'll have to do a whole episode on that soon, Paul, to talk about what this looks like. But that's interesting to me. I like the idea of a 4-tiered system from a current 2-tiered system. I think the other interesting part for me is this redoing of the Ndis Commission. Really interested in what that actually looks like and actually why, because I wonder, they said in the report that the Ndis Commission don't have enough teeth. I wonder, wouldn't you just bolster their powers as opposed to rebranding and renaming? I know government love to rebrand, but I kind of think, is that a good use of taxpayers' money to rebrand and change the name from one thing to another, just to change the powers? I don't work in government, so I don't understand if that's a requirement. I also really wonder the reaction of the auditing bodies, because this obviously affects their model hugely. I've called a few to see if they want to have a chat about it with us on a podcast maybe. So they're the bits that fascinate me. I obviously work with a lot of SIL and SDA providers, so that's why I thought it would be great to kick this off with chatting to Debbie around SDA and SIL and really try and understand what the implications are for SDA and SIL, things like the IL, the separation. That's really interesting. I think there's a lot of wins. I think that actually they've made some really excellent points. I think the idea of a unified system and having a federal government department that works with state government departments is actually really, really good.
Yeah.
I think I have seen that there has been all of these supports disappear since NDIS, and, this idea of this island in the desert I can see how that has happened. And I think giving states responsibility for people with disability again, especially children before a diagnosis, is really important. Intervention is like the most important thing you can do for a child with disability, and yet we have this horrible process that you need a diagnosis, which takes years to get, and there's just not enough support during that process. Yeah. You also have people fighting for a diagnosis that might not be correct so that they can get funding, as opposed to having the right level of funding for their need. Yes. So I guess the early childhood teacher in me has a different perspective than the auditing side of me, and the consultant who works with SIL providers is looking for something different again. So I've read the report multiple times. I've got it highlighted on my desk. It's going to be a fundamental paper, I think, for the PhD that I'm doing in the space, and I'm really interested to see what comes of it. I'm interested in how long the government's going to take to review the report. I'm interested in what the timelines would be for rollout and who gets to decide on the detail, because the devil is going to be in the detail.
100%. 100%. I think there's a very wide-reaching way it's going to take on there, wide-reaching way that it's going to affect the industry. But I think at the end of the day, it is going to be what is actually put in place, how long will it take, and what real effect will it have on the industry with what we actually end up with out of all of this.
Yeah, I agree. So why don't we now jump to recommendation 8 specifically. So recommendation 8 is housing and living supports for participants who require 24/7 are a key feature of the NDIS. the notes that I've made around this are that they've said that these supports are critical for participants who have high support needs and require a significant amount of assistance through the day, as well as overnight supports. I liked the stats that there are 41,000 participants receiving 24/7 support, including 31,500 participants that are in SIL and 9,500 receiving the equivalent of high-level daily life supports. I haven't seen stats like that before. They also said that there are payments to SIL alone are $8.8 billion, representing a quarter of the total scheme payments. So, that's huge, right? I didn't realize just how big SIL was a portion of the scheme. And I suppose focusing on that is really important because quality of life starts with your home, with your shelter, being a human right, being that bottom level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Having a suitable home is just so important. So I don't know, Debbie, do you want to make comments around the actions for recommendation 8 and your thoughts around them?
Yeah, look, we did have more of an idea of just how big that SIL budget is. And understand that is a major focus of the NDIA. Certainly when they're talking about the budget running to crazy figures and the projections just being out of hand. And obviously we know that is a large percentage of it. And we know that SIL is very closely tied with SDA. I think pretty much every SDA participant has SIL funding. Obviously there are more participants with SIL that don't need SDA. And I guess that's why this has become such a major focus. But I think I was more sort of focused on the actions, the recommendations 9 with regards to other areas of the home and living.
Yeah. So from recommendation 8, my kind of thoughts were the first thing was around budgets being consistent. And I guess this is something that I hear from SIL providers all the time, that budgets just aren't consistent. You have 2 or 3 people in a SIL home. One of them has 300,000, one has 200,000, one has 500,000, and that the differences in those funding is really hard to manage. So they didn't say bands or they didn't give detail about this, but I guess the idea of having consistent funding can only be positive unless that means a reduction in funding, of course.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah, and look, that is such an important thing, that there is regularity and consistency brought into this, because we've seen that is just not the case. But at the end of the day, it comes down to providing participants with what they need.
Yeah.
But also still bringing in that choice and control. And that's sort of where I'm kind of wondering where some of these recommendations are going. To me, it doesn't really fit in with that.
Yeah.
But I guess we need to see how this is all going to actually be implemented, the processes and procedures that they're going to have to put into place to make this happen, including the legislative changes that will be required.
Yeah. The second action under this recommendation is, as part of a local navigation function, the National Disability Agency should commission house and living navigators to provide advice on participants' housing and living options. And so this concept of housing and living navigator seems to be in line with this other recommendation around potentially replacing support coordinators and LACs. And so I guess that is a huge monumental shift. If we're not going to have support coordinators, maybe reduce plan managers over time, and we're moving to a idea of a care navigator, and in housing, a specific housing and living navigator. I'm a little bit confused about how this would work. And is this someone like an LAC that's done through a tender? Is this a function inside government? Is this a function of the agency? How is this being run? I don't know. Does anyone have any thoughts about the coordination side?
Yeah, I think that I was reading that there will be a tender system for people to apply will be given the role of navigator. So going back to the sort of original LAC, the NDIS actually appointing them.
Yeah.
So I believe it's going to be more along those lines than someone just deciding they want to do it and apply for registration in that or whatever.
Yeah.
I see
That's
that
interesting.
navigator role being, there's several places where they've said we're going to have a navigator in this area or we're going to have a navigator for this area. I think that really is just them going, well, we need someone to organize this area for participants, but we're not really sure how that's going to look. So I think that's just for now. I see it as a bit of an overarching, here's how we're going to actually manage that for participants. Because now at the moment they've got a support coordinator, a plan manager, a local area coordinator. They've got people who are telling them all different sorts of things to do. And particularly when it comes to housing, the disconnect of information for a lot of people has probably caused a lot of those issues. So having someone who understands the housing side of it, be that navigator, but again, as to how they appoint that person, whether it's tender or how that's set up, would be really interesting to see.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's a great initiative, and they do specify that there will obviously be careful. I'm just reading here: careful process of design and testing this idea in partnership with people with disability and the sector. So obviously, I mean, that's going to be part of every part of these recommendations in this overall review. But I think that is an interesting concept, the navigators.
I wonder why they feel the support coordination isn't working, because for me, the support coordinators are so vital in helping the participants get the funding they need. I know that's not their role, the applicants. You think it's because they've taken on the role of advocate that they're like, well, that it's not how we intended it to work? Or is it, I just wonder how they came to the realization or the idea that support coordinators are going to be replaced by navigators. Are we just changing a title, or are we actually fundamentally changing the role and not having someone? For me, the best support coordinators that I know and work with are people who case manage and are social workers or thereabouts by background and are really good at holding the person's hand through the process to make sure they navigate this very complex process with a little bit of guidance and mentoring almost. And I just wonder, is the navigator if it's through a government tender, does that mean that it's not this independent role that advocates for the participant? Is it advocating for the governance to reduce funding or minimize or keep funding in check? Is it about funding and sustainability of the scheme, or is it about the participant's choice and control and getting the best outcome? I don't know.
I think you hit the nail on the head there, to be honest. Is it a space where the government can just have a little bit extra control? Because obviously a lot of it's gotten away from them at this point about who does what and how people access funding. I think it'll be interesting to see, is a navigator a government-led position so that they can say, we need to keep it within these reins. So it'd be interesting.
Yeah. What I'm reading something here that says navigators would be commissioned and funded by the NDIA outside of participant plans. They would need to be independent, meaning they could not provide other NDIS services. They would have nationally consistent governance, branding, online services, information management, monitoring, and training.
It sounds like a new sector. How long is it going to take for someone to trademark Navigators Australia?
I'm sure it's done already.
I'm waiting for that to happen. Everybody currently with Navigate in their name is just going, yes. So, yeah.
Win.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay. The next point for me, the next recommendation was around this idea of try before you buy. So the action is that the NDIA should fund and implement a process for participants to try a new living arrangement at key life stages before they commit to them. So for me, I think this happens already in many ways where you go to a respite service over a period of time and the respite service becomes your SIL provider because you're building those relationships. I guess I wonder how it will be funded. What does that look like? Is that a transition process? Is that something that is manageable for SIL providers? How does an SDA provider do that? Are they expected to have an extra bedroom where they can do transitions, or like do they keep a room vacant so that they can transition to a certain home? And what is that process of? Is this months? Is this weeks? Is this years? Because currently, if a participant vacates, there's a very small window that there's payments for. So obviously, keeping a home filled is required currently. If you're having to transition people to try before you buy, what exactly are those payment terms and how does that affect the business model or the cash flow?
Yeah, absolutely. I looked at that and I didn't have any thoughts. I don't know how that would work. Look, we do a little bit in the respite STA area. Our model is probably a bit different from the standard SIL operator who's bringing people into a specific home that they operate respite out of. And that's probably is, as you said, that's the way it's already being done. Within the SDA environment, I'm not sure how that would be doable. They would obviously need to completely review funding for that. But yeah, that would need a lot of working through, I think, to make something like that work.
Yeah. Yeah. And the last recommendation, the last action there is that the NDIA should commission a shared support facilitation function to empower participants with exercise joint decision making. So I don't have any issues with that. I think anything that gives the participant more decision making powers is positive. Is there anything that I've missed in that? Is there a double meaning I'm not getting?
No, I think that is definitely a very positive recommendation or action point. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
The only thing that's
totally. We've.
Sorry, Debbie. Yeah.
I was going to say the only thing that they're talking about shared, and we'll move on to this in the next action section 9. They're talking about a shared support average ratio of 1 to 3 across the board, which is not kind of what we're really seeing moving forward into SDA. But of course, this is obviously a bit more broad. It's the whole home and living area. But I think, working through those shared supports, that's where so many complications happen, and having a way of arranging and organising those, facilitating those is definitely welcome.
I think the other point there is that they've said a number of times about this online system to advertise vacancies. I think that's maybe the next recommendation also. But I think that if there was like a, domain.com, realestate.com that you could see, sell vacancies, see where they are, have a look at the homes, that would be quite an impressive thing. That would be quite good for participants and for providers to advertise vacancies and look at matching and how that works. I think that would be positive because the matching of participants is obviously such a challenge, and deciding who to live with and who you want to live with, where you want to live, where it's close to, so you remain inside your communities are all important aspects of living.
Yeah. For me, just on that last point of recommendation 8, I saw it quite a harkening back to recommendation 5, which was around that idea of 9E and people who assist with decision making, what its own recommendation inside of that and how they do that without it being exploitive. I'm not really sure. Maybe again it pulls back to that navigator. But they want to have provide better support people with disabilities to make decisions about their lives. That just looks to me like it's pulling back to that point again, 8.4. So it'd be interesting to see how they implement a process that people are assisted with decision making for their best outcome that doesn't then open them to exploitation. So I think it'll be a very interesting space to look at over the next little while.
All right, now let's jump into recommendation 9. It's deliver a diverse and innovative range of inclusive housing and living options. The first and third action point or action items are really around the need for more data. And I think we can all agree that more data has to be good, especially you, Debbie. You're the data queen. You spend hours going through the data. So if there was an easier way to pull that, surely that's just better for all the stakeholders.
Oh, look, absolutely. And they do go into detail in this, describing what that data should look like, what additional information we should be getting. And I totally agree with that. The more the better. And I think they haven't even gone far enough in what we'd like to see. But definitely it broke down sort of the pipeline specifically to development so that people can plan, developers and providers can plan better to meet the demand, and also just a greater demand set of information about what participants have funded, what funding they have, what they are specifically looking for, far more detailed information that we're currently getting. So it's all around providing the data for the providers and the developers to meet the demand that's currently there and the demand that is going to be coming in the near future.
Yeah.
Because we don't have that properly yet. We really don't have it. We're guessing a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And that's not good enough.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. Action 2 is around implementing a new funding approach for participants' shared living support to strengthen the focus on service quality and outcomes. So I'm reading this as more flexible funding, things like ILO and models like that. Is that how you both interpret it?
Yeah, I think I saw a lot.
They're talking about a bundle of shared supports, so the participants' funding should be pooled to cover that bundle. And look, I think that I'm not quite sure how that would work, and obviously they've got ideas that they've put forward when that's just the action point, but when you read the more detailed information, I think that sounds like a great idea and a way to streamline those supports and ultimately reduce the funding that is required to all the different participants living in shared homes.
Yeah. And so I've seen some pushback online from people saying that this kind of means that, there's limited choices for people with disability because they can't choose to live by themselves, because it looks like it's really looking like a shared living solution is what is being provided. And I understand really that's just around the sharing something to think about. I've seen a lot recently of one bedroom within a 10-bedroom home, but having fully contained and having little villas, or units that are SDA units that might have six units in the building with one OOA as a concierge model to serve them. I'm wondering if that is still going to work in this model, being that it's talking about these shared services, or does that still fit that model because you're still sharing the supports? They're just living somewhat more by themselves and not having to share with other participants.
Yeah, look, I think there's definitely a way that can be worked. Under that concierge model, you are going to be sharing certain requirements, living in that same dwelling and sharing your carers and your supports and things like, shopping arrangements and all that sort of thing. I think there is definitely a place for that, that won't take away choice and control. But I think there's also an element of it that it will impact on those choices, and that's got to be carefully navigated.
Yeah. The next one is your favorite one, Debbie. It is around the removal of improved livability as a category and the review of the remaining categories and associated design standards to evaluate their effectiveness. Now, that wording leads me to think that maybe they think they're not currently effective. And I'm wondering about that.
Yeah, I know. I kind of ignore that second bit. I've got it highlighted, but I'm like, well, far as we know, they're pretty cost effective and effective, and from what we heard of real life participants moving into the homes, okay, yes, there's cost effectiveness, but it's also about the independence and the fact that these people have their own home for the first time ever in a lot of cases. It completely changes everything in their life, and they are so happy. They are living with choice and control that they've never had. And I can't see that, there's probably some tweaks that could be made, and certainly with the design guidelines, which is brought in later action points in this section. But yes, back to the improved livability. The improved livability category should be replaced as it is seen as not value for money. Now, this is obviously it was a bit of a shock, but the first thing I thought of, well, that's really interesting because 6 months ago, the NDIA SDA price review panel, the incomes for improved livability homes and IL funded tenants massively, up to about 170% in some cases. And the reason that they did that has been discussed over and over again was that, firstly, there was no IL homes being developed. Secondly, because IL participants can live in the FA and HPS category dwellings, they weren't being accepted as tenants in those homes because their funding was too low. So that was brought in to address that imbalance and give IL funded participants the opportunity to reside in homes that they'd previously been locked out of, basically, and also to have homes built specifically for them. So in a way, this is saying to me, well, did the price review panel make a mistake? Did they screw up here? And that also in the next action point is kind of highlighted because they're saying that the IHA CPA, the Independent Health and Aged Care Pricing Authority, should be expanded to advise on pricing and costing matters for specialist disability accommodation. So are they saying that price review panel just basically did a bad job all over? They should be kicked out and never given the job again? I don't know. I'm, confused, basically, as to why this is. And I guess this also goes back to the fact that they're saying the IL category should be replaced. I think we actually missed the previous one where it says, or maybe not, it might be further on, that there should be another new category of SDA being brought in that is for a much lower level of support requirements and for people that don't need SDA, in effect. So it's an SDA category for people that don't need SDA, and they're going to lump people who've got IL funding into that. And basically it's only funding for the supports, not for their house, not for the bricks and mortar.
Yeah. Yep, that's the second last action point. New SDA category is funded for shared living supports not eligible for existing categories.
Which confuses me because there's a lot of people that are eligible for IL, which is an existing category. So they're now saying that those people shouldn't have SDA. I know that IL is it's got if you walk into an IL home, you don't really notice a lot of differences from a regular well-designed house these days. It looks much the same. It doesn't look like a disability home. Obviously, you've got all flat level services, you've got better lines of sight, so more open spaces, but you don't have the large, wide doorways and hallways because it doesn't need to be wheelchair accessible. You've got luminous contrasts, all the doors and handles and switches are all placed in easy to find areas. Other than that, it does look like a regular home, but I think that there's a place for that for people who've got cognitive dysfunction that really need those requirements. That could lead into the discussions of bringing the national construction codes and the SDA guidelines, design guidelines more in line with each other. And that could be a whole nother area that these new SDA properties might still need to meet some basic guidelines. But it sounds like to me they're pulling it out of the SDA payment scheme.
Yeah.
But still calling it SDA. I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
look
because
at
maybe
that,
that's what we think.
funding for SDA accommodation for people that don't really need SDA as far as they're concerned just sounds a lot like SIL. So I'm really confused
Exactly.
how they're going to bring under SDA and have it separated from that 24/7 support anyway.
Is it maybe,
So I think, yeah.
do you think it could be a transitional thing where it's for people who are leaving, who have a disability that might be degenerate or that, might be in informal supports transitioning in or something? I'm not sure either.
I look, it could potentially be for a lot of the people that are currently living in older style disability housing. That is potentially the physical property might not be great because it's just old. But they might not really need all those extras that an improved livability home gives them. But they do still need the 24/7 support. I think we need to see a lot more information around this recommendation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We talked about the pricing regulator one. The next one is around the NDIA in consultation with state and territory government should commission SDA where it's not adequately met by the private investor model. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. I think this is a wonderful action point and recommendation. We know there are areas in remote parts of Australia that there are participants, they're desperate, they need a house, and it's just not feasible to build it for private investment. It's just there's no builders there. It's just going to cost crazy amounts of money to ship a whole team of builders in and the supplies, and no one's going to do it. So I think in that case, it really does need to be collaboration with the state and territory governments to step up.
And that seems to be a really big part of this review, this constant pushback to, sorry, government, this is your job. You do need to fill these gaps. This is actually your responsibility. You can't just privatize it and push it to the private market and expect them to do all of the things. It's still a government responsibility, this stewardship idea. So, I think that's interesting. The next one we spoke about briefly is my favorite one in this, which is the new commission should regulate SDA dwellings and make sure that they're managed in accordance with the needs of participants and mandate the separation of SDA and living support providers. And anyone who's heard me talk about it, all of the clients who call me and say, how do I do both SIL and SDA? And I say, there's no way you don't. And they get cranky at me and go and find another consultant who will do their registration with SDA and SIL on the same business. Hopefully this is a really clear indication that it shouldn't be the case. For me, what I'm wondering about is at what level is it separated? Is it simple enough to have two companies? Is it separate leadership? Is it separate governance? Is it, because we know that the large providers in the space have two companies, one for SIL and one for SDA. At what level does it need to be separated? And how do you manage that? And how do you transition for the providers that are doing both currently? How much separation does there need to be? Is it shared ownership? Is it shared directorship? Is it management team level? How does that look?
Yeah, absolutely. And ironically, we just had on our podcast, we had an episode go live this morning, which was actually questions to an email we received from a provider who is obviously trying to operate in the SIL space, asking us how they can get into the SDA, answering his different questions and addressing his different concerns there, and basically saying, no, don't do it. Absolutely. As you said, Tanya, we've also been talking about this for a long time. And this, I like to also point out, this says it should be a legal and practical separation, mandated separation. yes, it needs to happen. That does say there are exceptions that can be clearly specified. For example, in remote areas where separation is not feasible, we obviously do need that to be considered. But yeah, definitely. For the little smaller SIL operators that think they'll just jump on and become an SDA operator and own a couple of homes and do everything, yeah, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But as you said, Tanya, for the larger organisations that are already operating it as two separate companies, how they legally mandate that separation, where that point is of separation, who knows?
Yeah. Wonderful. The next one is around the agree and implement intergovernmental strategies for underpinning and repurposing age specialist disability accommodation stock by states and territories. So this is talking about legacy stock, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And look, I think this is probably a really apt time to talk about this because, as you said before, I go into the data and there's so much existing stock out there, which is basic legacy. Legacy is properties that are 6 or more tenants, funded for 6 or more tenants. The existing stock is registered or enrolled as new build, but it's anything with 1 to 5 tenants that is basically not new build, and in a lot of cases is basic and not fit for purpose. And we are now seeing more providers coming to us saying, look, we've got clients who are living in these homes. They're just totally unsuitable. We need to get new stock to move them into, or we need to knock down, rebuild what we've got because there's just no land in the area to get something new built. We need to find ways of converting our current stock into something that is more fit for purpose. So the fact that this has been addressed here, I think, is really, really powerful.
And it's the next one follows on there. The next one follows on there also saying that the bedroom count for aged SDA dwellings should be reduced.
Yeah, that was interesting that for the legacy dwellings that house more than 3 participants, or the existing that house more than 3 participants, once those participants move out and you're down to, say, 3 residents, the property should be able to be reclassified as a 3-resident property, even if it's got 6, 7 bedrooms there, I guess. So, and that just means that the participants don't have to be forced to live in a group home with more residents than they would wish to live with. It gives them the chance to live in a smaller dwelling or the same size dwelling, but with less people. And this, I guess, also ties in with when they're talking about this number 3, back in some of the notes in this section 9, was that the funding for participants should typically be based on an average shared support ratio of 1 to 3.
Yeah.
Which is something I'd like to also just fill out a bit more. We're seeing that there's a lot of SDA homes that have been built over the last 5, 6, 7 years that are for 3 participants. Almost none of them have 3 participants in there. They've all got 2. So because the participants have choice and control, they'll move into another home that only has 1 other participant rather than one that's already got 2 participants. So basing the average shared support ratio of 1 to 3 kind of across the board for all home and living, I'm a little concerned about that, confused about that, given that it's not what is being reflected in reality.
I thought the reason for 1 to 3 from a SIL perspective, not an SDA perspective, was around this idea that each participant gets 8 hours of funding. So there's 3 lots of 8 hours in a 12, and that's how you make the funding work. And so I guess that comes back to, is 8 hours then enough to be funding? If 1 to 2 is actually where we're ending up, then, does that 8 hours need to be raised? And is it fair to just fund someone for 8 hours if they do need 24 hours of support? Because what I think happens is providers decide then not to take participants who have under a certain amount of funding because they can't make that metrics work on a 1 to 3, so that there's then participants who don't get the ability to live in a nice still home because they're not able to have enough funding to justify that 24 hours of support that's needed with the support side.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. That's an interesting take on it, and very much is potentially where that has come from. Obviously, we look at this from the SDA perspective primarily, and just what we're seeing out there.
Yeah,
on the ground.
I think people much prefer, to live with as little people as possible. You think about, I've lived in their houses, or had flatmates before, and I much prefer to live by myself.
Absolutely.
So at some point, you have to say, if you're not living with the people that you want to be living with, it's such a huge impact on your quality of life, right? Like, dealing with the issues that can happen with flatmates, and you've got the increased thing that participants could have different behaviours of concern, and having people together does that increase triggers? Does that increase behaviours? I think that matching process is so important. And maybe this idea of having a navigator help providers navigate how to actually make this work. I think it's just the practical implications of how do you actually navigate that as a provider, because the model only works if you have those bedrooms full, and that, we're the Profitable Ndis Provider podcast. We talk about you have to be profitable first, because if you're not profitable, your business isn't sustainable and you're putting everyone at risk. And so if by taking on 2 participants, your business model is at risk of not being financially viable, you have to put in a third, even if this means that those other 2 participants aren't incredibly happy. And then you've got this retention problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it does. It opens up another complete can of worms when you start talking about compatibility of people living in a home. It's so complicated. And from our little perspective in the SDA world, I don't know how still providers do it. I really don't. With the challenges of making it profitable and making it work financially.
Yeah. And the last action item then is that the Australian government should agree and publish targeted action plan for housing under Australian Disability Strategy. And I think, again, we can agree that more data is good data. More than holding government to account to provide reports and information can only be a positive thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm
absolutely.
Very well.
And
so I'm really well surprised in this space, for instance, with SDAs, there's not more mandatory reporting about who's doing what's live, what's currently filled, because it seems to have such a lag with people actually finding out what's available, what's out there, and who's in the house, how full the house is, all that sort of stuff. So wherever we can get more information live, it's just going to help everybody move forward a lot faster.
Yeah, absolutely. And also in this action point, they do touch on the National Construction Code, and the livable housing design guidelines, and also the SDA guidelines, and the fact that these all need to be brought together into some workable code that is not confusing for builders. It doesn't, override other codes and other design guidelines, and they've got to really make that consistent so that everyone understands what these properties need to be built to physically, whether it's a SIL property, whether it's an SDA property.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think that was really interesting. Is there any other takeaways or comments that either of you wanted to make on this?
I'm reading through my notes. I think that pretty much covered everything in the home and living section of the review. That, most of it great, positive, some of it confusing, some of it very surprising. But taken as part of the overall review, which obviously you'll be going into in more detail in other episodes. I think there's a lot of really good recommendations that have come out of this. that are really positive.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think so
absolutely.
too. I think the other thing is that it's to remind everyone that these are just recommendations at this point,
Yeah.
and it's not happening immediately. These are things that are going to take time and consideration to roll out. They said a 5-year transition, but we're probably looking at 6 months for the government to review this before they even decide what recommendations to take on. And then you've got multiple changes in legislation to enact. And then you've got a rollout strategy. So when they say 5 years, it's probably more like 6 to 10.
Yeah. I read somewhere in these notes that we're talking about by 2032
Okay.
having
Yeah.
things in place. So I'm not sure where that was now I'm looking, but look, there's none of this is going to happen overnight, and they've recommended certain parts of it that should be a priority to be worked on first. But definitely it's, just the fact, as you said, that there are going to be significant legislative changes, and new organizations and groups, and committees set up to start looking into all of this. It's going to take quite a while.
Yeah. And I think the other piece of advice, or the other thing I would say, is that if there's people who are really passionate about this, they should look for opportunities to be part of that consultation and actually put their voices forward. There's nothing more annoying than people shouting from the sidelines but not willing to actually give the input to someone who's going to do something about it. And so all of this should have multiple lanes of consultation. So I think if anyone's really passionate about it, has a really strong opinion, doesn't think that something's right or thinks something's great, but we really should be putting pen to paper and speaking to your MPs, speaking in the whichever format they give us to give consultation, and really think about what that looks like so that your voice is captured and that you can be part of the change as opposed to just fighting the change. Because if they've decided to make changes, they're going to make them. It's how do you be part of the solution and work through that with government, where you're able to, as opposed to heckle from the sidelines.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Any last comments or thoughts, Paul?
Yeah, look, I think we just touched on the main thing there, is that it is just recommendations. It's going to take a long time. Definitely with my clients, I'll be saying, look, here is part of what should make up a 10-year strategy. And for a lot of my clients, it's around the idea of result-based support, who you collaborate with. If you're in those areas that look like the recommendation is going to make your position a bit wobbly, how do you diversify? How do you then, make sure that what you do in this space is results-based and it's going to go in line with what looks to be the most obvious position that the NDIS will take over the next 10 years, for instance. So hopefully no one is going to take this and go, the world is falling, the sky is falling, the sky is falling.
Yeah. I guess the other thing to note is that we're going to record another episode next Friday, talking to a specialist support coordinator about this idea of market stewardship, talking about the pricing implications to the pricing guide, this idea of navigators, and anything else that we can get. She's both a specialist support coordinator and a SIL provider. So we'll be talking about her take and some further thoughts on recommendations 1 and thereabouts. So keep in touch with us about that. Follow us on the socials to be updated. And we're trying to work with one to speak to some auditors about this idea of having to be a registered provider as well. And so that will come live at some point in the next couple of weeks. If you've got any burning questions that you want to direct to Paul or myself, or maybe even Debbie, please reach out to us and have a chat. We really think this is a dialogue and a conversation for us to work through together as a sector, rather than panicking in our own little silos. So hopefully this starts the conversation, and we realise that actually this is probably good for the sector and for participants and for sustainability. And there's a lot of positives to take out of this also. Debbie, any last words from you?
No, I totally agree with everything you just said, Tanya. I think that this is the start of the review process, really. And everyone's got to work together to have their say in it and to make it the best it can be. But, we've got a fantastic NDIS system. Yes, it's got a lot of issues, but this is how we make it better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
We'll catch up with you guys again really soon. Keep in touch, and until next time, have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Paul. See you later.
See ya.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Profitable NDIS Provider podcast with Tanya Gomez and Paul Bryan. We hope you found today's episode informative and valuable. If you enjoyed the show, please don't forget to subscribe, leave us a rating, and share it with others who could benefit from our insights. Until next time, keep thriving.